right, good morning. We're beginning a new program activity this week, and that's using the international lesson in Sunday school. That usually takes a whole hour. We're going to try to bridge it down to about a 15-minute little presentation. If you have the quarterly, there's good information in there, as well as the scriptures are printed in the New International Version, and some activity pages which are also available for you to print down on this video. We're going to be looking at the book of James for the next 4 weeks as part of the international lesson. And this week we're taking the first half of chapter 1. Next week it'll be the second half of chapter 1, and then we'll go into chapter 2 and the others that follow in the book of James. When we look at the book of James, there are a couple of things that I don't want to get technical, but I think there's some important information there. One is, who is James? There are 3 James that are possible mentioned in the Bible. One is James, the brother of John. They were the 2 fishermen that Jesus called to be disciples, along with 2 other fishermen, Andrew and his brother Simon Peter. There's also James, the son of Alphaeus, that was a part of the disciples. And Matthew is sometimes listed as Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Maybe a different Alphaeus, that was a common name. But none of those are the James that we think of who wrote this letter. This James is probably the James that was the leader of the church, as we read about it in Acts chapter 15. He was the leader of the Jewish part of the church, as Paul became the leader of the Gentile church, along with Barnabas, and then later his other companion Silas. Paul mentions James a couple of times in his letters. One in Galatians. He speaks about conferring with James, the brother of our Lord. And that would indicate that this James was perhaps part of Jesus' family growing up. Some traditions see him as a cousin. In any event, they were probably closely together geographically and age-wise as they were in that family of Joseph and Mary. There's also a reference made to this James in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples. He appeared to the women, but he appeared to Peter and to the disciples, to 500 people, he said, and then he appeared to James. And then Paul says, and last of all, he appeared to me. Special appearances to 3 people there in particular, Peter, James, and Paul, that were part of that. Now, I'm going to come back to that because I think there's a very significant thing about that appearance to James, and I think there's something very significant about the idea of James being in the family of Jesus. As James begins this letter, he says there are 3 things in the first part of the letter that are important to note. One is, he says, count it all joy when you enter into different or various trials or tribulations. Now, sometimes that word is understood to mean persecutions, suffering. It can be used that way, although there's another Greek word that generally refers to tribulations or suffering more than this. Matter of fact, this word for trials, various trials, is the same word that in verse 12 will say, you don't tempt God and God doesn't tempt you. You are tempted when you are led aside by your desires. That's the same word here that is used in temptation as used in the beginning of this word in chapter in verse 3 for various trials. It's also the same word that is used in the Lord's Prayer as you read it in Matthew chapter 6 where it says, and lead us not into temptation. Same Greek word there that means that. So the sense of the word is not so much that you're being persecuted or being martyred for your faith. It's just that there are difficulties in life. Now, Jesus uses the other word, and I'm not sure Jesus spoke Greek, but Matthew as he records it, or John as he records it, uses the Greek word that means more of persecution or difficulty of life. And he says, in this world you will have tribulation. In other words, you're going to have difficulties. That's just a part of life. But the counting it joy has to do with a sense of perspective, understanding that life is not a bed of roses, and that even as Christians, we don't get it all easy. Sometimes there are difficulties in life, and we have to deal with them. It's not fun to deal with them, but they're out there and they have to be dealt with. Now, as James discusses this experience of trials, temptations, he says, endure them. That is, persevere. Put effort into dealing with them. And as he talks about that, he says that helps us to grow in our faith. Now, interesting that Paul in Romans 5 says a similar thing, where he says, you must endure your difficulties or your trials. And he uses there the stronger word for suffering. But he says if you endure it, it builds patience, and patience builds character, and character gives hope. So he takes it a little bit farther than James does. James says it'll give you patience and it'll help you to grow. That's important. Now, we need struggles in life. If life is too easy, we don't make it. There's a simple illustration of this in the realm of nature. Some experiments were done with both butterflies and chickens. You know that a butterfly, as a caterpillar, begins to weave a cocoon. And inside that cocoon, a metamorphosis takes place. That is, the caterpillar changes and develops wings and different sets of legs instead of so many legs. And then it comes out of its cocoon. It has to break out. What they did in the experiment was to open up the cocoon at the appropriate time and let the butterfly out. What happened was the butterfly was so weak that it couldn't fly, it couldn't spread its wings. It needed that struggle to build up its ability to be a butterfly. And so without that struggle, it didn't make it. They found the same thing with a chicken egg. As the egg came to the time of hatching, and as they could hear the chick inside beginning to try to struggle to get out, they opened up the egg and let the chick out. And again, the chick was so weak that it couldn't survive. We sometimes need a struggle to help us to grow. And that's part of life. It builds patience, it builds character, and it really, in the long run, gives us hope. So that's the reason, in a sense, to count it joy, because it helps us to be whom God dreams of us to be. Now, there's a second thing in that listing, in those first 12 verses. And the second thing is wisdom. In James's letter, he says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all people freely and doesn't show partiality. By the same token, if you go to the book of Proverbs, it talks about their striving or seeking wisdom, putting some effort into getting wisdom. In the book of Chronicles, there's a listing of the people who came to support David when he was fighting against Saul, and when he had been made king of Hebron. Now, he wasn't king of all of Israel, because that was Saul still at that point in time, but he'd been made king of Hebron, which was the lower part of the kingdom. And in that experience, different groups came to identify with him, different tribes. And it says in 1 Chronicles, of the tribe of Issachar. Now, they list some of the other tribes, and there were thousands that came. Interesting that in the tribe of Issachar, it only mentions 200 chiefs and their followers. Now, how many thousands that is, we don't know, and it may not be 1,000, but we know it's 200 chiefs. And then it adds this, and he says, men who had understanding of their times to know what Israel should do. Did you get that? Men who had understanding. They had a sense of wisdom. They not only were good soldiers, they were good thinkers. They were good statesmen and knew how to lead. And they became a prized part of David's army. In our own lives, we know that sometimes we wish we knew better what to do. We wish we knew the right answers. And the Bible talks about praying and asking God. A.W. Tozer, one of the great leaders of the church back in the 20th century, a man of deep spiritual insight who wrote books like The Pursuit of God and The Knowledge of the Holy. He, in a short essay, talked about knowing the will of God. And he said we need to get down and pray and ask God to give us wisdom. And then he said we need to get up and act. And then he went on to say, and in our actions, if we're right, be humble. And if we're wrong, be honest. See, that's real wisdom. Because we're not always going to be right. James in the 3rd chapter of this letter will say, don't be anxious to be a leader. Don't be anxious to be one of the top people in the church. And then he goes on to say, because we all make many mistakes. That's a pretty wise statement, I would say, on the part of James in that line. Jesus in his own life, in Luke chapter 6, he's getting ready to choose his disciples. Now, Mark tells it a little differently in Matthew, but in Luke it says that he went up in the mountains to pray. And he prayed all night. And then it says he came down and he called 12 to be with him. Now, he asked God for wisdom, but he came down and he made choices. Now, one of his choices wasn't the best. Judas of Iscariot betrayed him, turned him in. Even Peter denied him, and Thomas doubted. Now, I don't think Jesus felt that he made bad choices, but all of our choices aren't necessarily going to meet with everybody's approval. But we make them as best we can. That's wisdom. And then we're humble if we're right. We're honest if we're wrong. We need to be that indeed in truth. All right. The third thing that he talks about is wealth. Now we think of wealth as being in the ledger book, having our accounts in the black and not in the red. I think that that's a fair statement. I think we are bound as best we can to be diligent in our finances and careful. And that's true of a church as well as true of individuals. We need to weigh our decisions with wisdom and then to follow through and to be careful. But Jesus talked about a different wealth. There was one occasion when he was with his disciples and they were traveling through Samaria. And you may remember the story in John chapter 4 where they stop at the well, Jacob's well, and the disciples go into town to buy some food. And while Jesus is resting at the well, this woman comes there to get water in the middle of the day. And Jesus asked her for a drink. And she's surprised because she can tell he's a Jew by his garb, his prayer shawl that he wears and his other clothing. And she says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask of me, a Samaritan, and a woman for a drink of water? Well, he goes on to talk with her further about it, and it becomes a great conversation. And then she runs off to town to tell everybody she's found the Messiah. The disciples come back in the meantime, and they bring back their lunches that they got in town, and they ask Jesus if he'd like to eat. And then Jesus makes this interesting statement. He says, I have food to eat that you don't know about. In other words, what he was doing was feeding his soul as he had talked to this woman and brought to her hope, brought to her acceptance, brought to her a new life. That's a part of what we're talking about, the wealth. Jesus could talk about in his sermon on the Mount how the flowers, they don't weave, they don't sew, they don't spin yarn. And yet he goes on to say that Solomon in all of his glory, in all of his rich clothing, was not adorned like the flowers of the field. There's a wealth in perspective. In the book of Isaiah, the 55th chapter, the prophet says, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your toil for that which does not satisfy? And then he goes on to say, come buy bread and wine without money and without price. There's a sense of wealth in our perspective of life. It's kind of like the old adage, is the glass half full is it half empty? How we look at life makes a big difference. There was a man who made money in the oil industry. John D. Rockefeller was one of those. There were others that did that, and one of them was J. Paul Getty. And J. Paul Getty became very wealthy, a multimillionaire. But he died a very lonely man. He had all kinds of wealth, but he didn't trust his family. He thought that his relatives were just after his money. He didn't trust the people who worked for him. He was wealthy, but he was poverty-stricken too. He didn't have a healthy relationship with people, and I imagine he didn't have a healthy relationship with God because of feeling like everybody was after his money. Terrible, terrible poverty of spirit. C.S. Lewis made an interesting statement. C.S. Lewis is the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the other Chronicles of Narnia, and many books that he wrote during World War II to help people get through that time, particularly in England where he lived at that time. He said this: the only thing you can take to heaven is what you give away. Now think about that. The only thing you can take to heaven is what you give away. If you hold it fast to yourself, you'll never keep it. Jim Elliot, who was one of the missionaries who died in Ecuador with the Wandani Indians, natives, in 1956, had a statement. He said, "Why labor for that which you cannot keep to gain what you cannot lose?" Yeah. There are things that can be given to us that are the wealth of eternity. And we cannot lose them. And the things we work for here are so temporary. Well, those are three things that are in that first part of that the letter of James that he talks about. Trials of life, gaining wisdom, and the wealth of life. Now, the question comes to me is, where would James learn about those things? Where would he find about trials? And where would he find about wisdom and wealth? And that's why I go back to his family. If indeed he was a part of the family of Jesus, and the scriptures indicate that his brothers did not believe in him. You find that in John chapter 7, also John chapter 4, and Mark also talks about his brothers didn't believe in him. Matter of fact, they mocked him. On one occasion in John chapter 7, they said to him, "Why don't you go to Jerusalem and show everybody how great you are?" They didn't believe he was great, and they were picking on him. During that time, I wonder how Jesus reacted to that. I wonder how he felt when James and his others, brothers and family, even his mother at that point in time, thought he was out of his mind. And they were trying to take him home and get him some rest. They thought he was losing it. But Jesus dealt with them, I think, in a very loving way, understanding way. I think James probably in his life he had ambitions and drive and determination, and he saw Jesus enjoying the beauty. Kind of like we would say, stop and smell the coffee, or smell the roses, or take time to think. That sense of Sabbath, which doesn't necessarily have so much to do with a day, as it has to do with an attitude, a way of finding new strength, just as he did with the woman at the well when he said, "I've got food that you don't know about." And likewise, not just the wisdom there, but the wealth. When he died on the cross, they took what garments he had, they gambled for them. He didn't own a farm, he didn't own a car. Of course, nobody owned a car back then. He didn't own a chariot. He had none of that stuff. And as far as we know, the carpenter shop had gone to the rest of the family as he had gone off to be a messenger of God. But I think it was James who saw that and in a sense realized he'd been on the wrong side of the tracks. That he'd been missing out on life. And here's the key. When Jesus in his resurrection came back to appear to different people, even to 500, one time, he also took the time to appear to James. I wonder what he said to James as he appeared to him. I wonder if he said, "Well, I guess I showed you, James, what it's all about." I don't think so. Any more than I think he showed Paul that. I think he said, "James, I chose you a long time ago to be a leader in my church because I saw in you what could be a good leader and a great person. And I know that you didn't see it in me, but I see it in you. The same question was asked of Lincoln when he was president. You see, he chose a number of people to be in his cabinet who really didn't like him. They thought he was a buffoon. That was one of the words they used to describe him. One of his cabinet members called him that, compared him to an ape. And people asked him, Mr. Lincoln, why did you choose these people? And he responded, because they were the best people for the job. I think that was Jesus looking at James. And I think that's why James could write this letter. And it means so very much. Well, those are our thoughts for today. Next week we'll pick up on looking in a mirror and how easy it is to forget what we see as we look in the mirror. As Wesley said, and a good thought to take with us, he said this: do good, do no harm, love God. Good things to do. Take care. See you next week. Bye-bye now.